Chapter 4. Plague, Poems, and a Patron. When Robert Greene wrote his attack on Shakespeare in 1592, the theatres were closed. The plague had returned to London that summer, and the future for a dramatist was uncertain. Who could say when the theatres would open again? In fact, they were closed all through the following year, and by the spring of 1594 the actors were in serious trouble. Most writers at that time needed a patron. A lord like Lord Ferdinando Strange sometimes gave his name to a company of actors, but poets were the only writers who could hope for support. No help was given to dramatists. So in the spring of 1593, Shakespeare wrote a poem, Venus and Adonis, and published it with a letter to Henry Wriothesley, Earl of Southampton. We cannot be sure that he knew the Earl at this time, but it seems likely that they met and that Southampton invited him to his country house in Hampshire. Shakespeare's second long poem, The Rape of Lucrece, was published in the following year. In it, he says that his love for the Earl is without end, and promises that his past and future work is for his patron. The relationship between Shakespeare and Southampton has been a cause of argument. Was the Earl the handsome young man who appears in the sonnets? In these poems, the poet loves him, but the young man takes a dark-haired woman from him. We shall never know. Southampton was certainly handsome, and people said that he had physical relationships with other men, which was a crime in those days. When Shakespeare published Venus and Adonis, Southampton was only 20 years old. The political connections are more important. Southampton was a close friend of the Earl of Essex, a favourite of Queen Elizabeth and the leader of a political party. Essex continually criticised the government of Lord Burleigh, who had been the Queen's first minister since the beginning of her reign. After 1594, Shakespeare's theatre company supported Essex, and they were very lucky to escape punishment when he was executed in 1601. Southampton, too, was fortunate to be sent to prison instead of dying with him. There are two reasons for believing that Shakespeare spent time as a guest in Southampton's house in 1593. First, during that time he wrote a play called Love's Labour's Lost. He usually used stories by other people as a starting point, but on 3 occasions in the 1590s the story was the product of his own imagination. These plays were written for special occasions, though they were all performed in the public theatre later. Love's Labour's Lost is full of the kind of romantic language that lords and ladies liked to hear, but there are also a few political jokes and characters who make fun of other writers. The story begins with the real meeting some years before between the Protestant King of Navarre, by 1593 Henry IV, King of France, and the Princess of France. The king's followers in the play, Biron and Longueville, have the names of the lords who were with him when the Earl of Essex met Henry in France in 1591. It seems likely that the play was written for a private performance at Southampton's house while the theatres were closed because of the plague. After Queen Elizabeth's death in 1603, King James I freed Southampton from prison, and he soon became the favourite dancing partner of the new Queen, Anna of Denmark. In the winter of 1604–5, Shakespeare's company performed at court 11 times. Southampton probably chose the plays, 8 of them by Shakespeare. Most of them were his more recent successes, but among them was Love's Labour's Lost. It seems a strange choice unless Southampton was celebrating his good luck and remembered its first performance in happier times many years earlier. Even if Shakespeare spent some time in Southampton's house in 1593–4, the young lord could not give him much help. He had annoyed Lord Burleigh by refusing to marry his granddaughter, and had spent most of his money. It seems that Southampton continued to think well of Shakespeare, but Shakespeare had to return to the theatre to earn his living. The future of the theatre in England in the spring of 1594 was very uncertain. Marlowe was dead. According to the official report, he had an argument with another man over a bill in a pub and was killed. But the man was not punished. The other man was a government spy, and Marlowe had also worked as a spy. Modern writers suggest that Marlowe was killed because he liked to shock people and knew too many of the government's secrets. On the 16th of April, 1594, Lord Ferdinando Strange died suddenly. He had been the patron of the company that Shakespeare had probably joined when he came to London. People said that the government had poisoned Strange because some Catholics wanted him to be king. His company had divided in two in 1591, when Edward Alleyn had had an argument with James Burbage. Alleyn and some other actors had left Burbage's theatre, taking some of the playbooks with them, and had joined a rival theatre owner, Philip Henslowe. Lord Strange had continued to be the patron of this group. While the theatres were closed, Alleyn had married Henslowe's daughter. Shakespeare probably stayed with the Burbage family at first, and for a time the Earl of Pembroke was their patron. In 1593, during the time of the plague, the two companies went on tours of the country. The Pembrokes' tour was a disaster, and the actors lost everything. Shakespeare was not with them, perhaps because he was staying with the Earl of Southampton. It seemed that the theatre in London would come to an end because there was no one to support it. Then the government saved it. It was fortunate for Elizabethan actors and for us that the Queen was very fond of plays. Every year she liked to see performances at court at Christmas time. The City Council often asked the government to close the theatres, but they were always told that they had to keep them open. The actors needed to practice before performing in front of the Queen. The government formed two new companies, and each had a patron. One company, acting at Henslowe's theatre, was led by Edward Alleyn. Shakespeare returned to the other company at Burbage's theatre. The leading actor there was Burbage's son, Richard, and its patron was Lord Hunsdon. Lord Hunsdon was the Queen's cousin, and an important man at court. He was an old man, but was a good friend to the actors. Shakespeare chose wisely when he joined Burbage. James Burbage, like Henslowe, often cheated the actors. But his son Richard was Shakespeare's friend. When his father died, Shakespeare became one of the partners in the company. Shakespeare wrote for the actors that he knew and his plays are the result of working as part of a team. So it is important for us that Burbage was a more interesting actor than Alleyn, and spent his whole life in the theatre. Alleyn left the stage in 1597 and grew rich as Henslow's partner. Burbage was still acting in the year of his death, 3 years after Shakespeare in 1619. Alleyn and Burbage were similar to the two leading actors in Shakespeare's plays in England in the 20th century, John Gielgud and Laurence Olivier. Alleyn, like Gielgud, had a beautiful voice. He was at his best in the long speeches that Marlowe wrote for him. They were fine words, but did not demand much movement. Burbage, like Olivier, was more active on the stage and could play many different parts. We do not know if Shakespeare had written Richard III before the theatres closed. He had already invented the character of this wonderful villain in the last part of his history play, Henry VI. It was the perfect part for Burbage, as it was hundreds of years later for Laurence Olivier. As usual, Shakespeare had copied another writer and improved his work. Richard is like the Jew of Malta in Marlowe's play of that name, but Shakespeare's play is better. The audience watch, half shocked and half amused, as the villain comes to the front of the stage. In the Elizabethan theatre he was in the middle of them, and tells them his plans. Then they watch, half shocked and half excited, to see if he will succeed. Chapter 5. Great Success and a Personal Tragedy. In the next 4 years, between 1594 and 1598, Shakespeare wrote 8 plays and became the leading dramatist of his time. The first 3, Richard II, Romeo and Juliet, and A Midsummer Night's Dream, show that the years of writing poems were still very much in his mind. 2 are tragedies, and the third is a comedy specially written for the wedding of Lord Hunsdon's granddaughter in 1596. But all 3 are still loved above all for the beauty of the language. While Laurence Olivier's best part was Richard III, John Gielgud's was Richard II. Even in these plays we can see how Shakespeare's skill in the theatre was growing. In Romeo and Juliet, the scenes between the lovers are full of beautiful speeches. But Shakespeare also included the practical words of the nurse, who came straight from his Stratford childhood, and the rather different ways of speaking of Mercutio and Capulet, Juliet's father. He was beginning to give each character a personal voice. A Midsummer Night's Dream is perhaps the loveliest play that Shakespeare wrote. Shakespeare invented 3 stories and put them together cleverly as the perfect entertainment for a wedding. One is about young lovers, as usual unwilling to obey their parents' wishes. Another is about the fairy king and queen, who use their magic power to confuse the lovers. The third is about a group of actors who are going to perform a play for the wedding of Theseus, the Duke of Athens, and Hippolyta. Professional actors enjoy making fun of ordinary people trying to act. A Midsummer Night's Dream contains a number of jokes about Shakespeare and his friends. The actors in the play perform a tragedy about 2 young lovers, like Shakespeare's last play, Romeo and Juliet, but their performance is full of comic mistakes. The leading actor, Bottom, is like many stars in the theatre. He wants to play all the parts himself. In A Midsummer Night's Dream, though, for the first time, Shakespeare suggests that he was beginning to think of plays as art. His character, Theseus, says that poets are like mad people. They imagine things that are not real. But Hippolyta answers that the audience have seen a dream which has the power to stay in the mind afterwards. We can recognize that something is true more easily in art than in real life. At one time, it was thought that Shakespeare planned to write a group of 4 plays about English history in the early 15th century. But the plays are very different from each other, so it seems that he wrote them one by one. Richard II is the tragedy of a man with little political ability who becomes king. His cousin, Bolingbroke, rebelled against him and became king in his place as Henry IV. Soon afterwards, Richard was murdered in prison, and Henry's supporters in the north, the Percy family, rebelled against him. In 1596, Shakespeare had a good reason for writing a play on this subject. The Percy family were Catholics, and many years earlier the company's patron, Lord Hunsdon, had fought against them and beaten them when they had rebelled against his cousin, the Queen. When they watched Richard II, the audience were sure to think of the Queen and her cousin. Many people in the audience also remembered 2 plays about the reigns of Henry IV and Henry V that had been very popular a few years before. These plays were really both about Henry V, the greatest English war leader in history at that time. He had got into trouble as a young man because he had a friend called Sir John Oldcastle, and they behaved badly. When he became king, he changed completely and was remembered afterwards as a hero. At first, Shakespeare planned to write 2 plays like this, one about Henry V while he was still a prince, the other about him as king. But when he invented the character of the prince's friend, Oldcastle, he saw that it was the perfect part for one of the stars of his company, the comic actor Will Kemp. As in many other plays, he used 2 similar stories for comparison. Here, one is serious and one is comic. The relationship between the prince and Oldcastle tells us something about the relationship between the prince and his father. But because the 2 stories are both very interesting, Shakespeare realized that he had too much to say for one play, so he divided the first play, called Henry IV, in 2. This was not the end of the matter. Henry IV Part 1 was acted with great success, but soon afterwards Lord Hunsdon died, and Lord Cobham took his place at the royal court. Lord Cobham belonged to the Oldcastle family. He complained that the company were making fun of Oldcastle, so Shakespeare had to change the name. This is why one of his most famous characters is called Falstaff. There is a story that Queen Elizabeth enjoyed the play so much that she wanted to see a play about Falstaff in love. Lord Cobham died in March, and Lord Hunsdon's son took his position. He was going to join the Queen for a celebration at Windsor that summer. Shakespeare had started writing Henry IV Part 2, but he had to stop and write a special entertainment, The Merry Wives of Windsor. It is said that he wrote it in 2 weeks. The play is very funny and has a lot of characters with amusing accents. One of them is a Welsh teacher who is annoyed with a little boy called William in a Latin lesson. Here, Shakespeare was remembering his childhood. As usual, he used the experience to improve his next play. Henry IV, Part 2, is not really a history play. Falstaff and his men appear in most of the scenes, which clearly take place in the England of Shakespeare's own time. The play suggests that the great days of the past have ended. Many people felt like that towards the end of the great Queen's reign. Falstaff in this play is not so amusing. He is old and tired and cheats simple country people like the judge, Shallow, while he is waiting for the prince to become king. Then he hopes that he will be a favourite at court. But at the end of the play, the new king, Henry V, gives him money, but says that he must stay away from him. Falstaff is the first of Shakespeare's characters who is so interesting on the stage that he has a life outside the theatre. People have heard of him before they see or read the play. This situation began 200 years ago, when it became the custom to talk about characters in plays as real people. And so today we may see Henry IV Part 2 performed with the prince as a kind of villain. The director thinks that the audience will feel more sorry for Falstaff and blame the prince for what happens to him. The same custom is the reason why Shylock, the villain in The Merchant of Venice, is often changed into a man who is unfairly punished, and Hamlet becomes a sad dreamer who cannot make up his mind. Although Shakespeare understood life better than most of his audience, he belonged to his own time. We cannot always expect him to think in the same way as we do. The Merchant of Venice is a typical example of this. Modern audiences feel guilty if they see a Jew as a villain because of the suffering of the Jewish people under Hitler. But in 1597 there were very few Jewish people in London, and they were not popular because most people thought that they had killed Jesus Christ. Shakespeare wrote this play because the rival company had had a great success the year before with new performances of Marlowe's The Jew of Malta, written a few years earlier. Barabbas, the Jew in Marlowe's play, is a villain like Richard III, with a cruel sense of humour. Burbage probably asked Shakespeare to write a part for him as good as that. Shakespeare found an Italian story about a businessman in Venice who borrowed money from a Jew to help his nephew. The young man hoped to marry a rich woman. The businessman signed a document which allowed the Jew to cut him with a knife if he did not pay on time. There was nothing in the story about revenge. In Shakespeare's play, Portia, the rich woman, becomes a beautiful young girl in love with the nephew, Bassanio. Antonio, the businessman, is Bassanio's friend, not his uncle. Shylock's behaviour is in the old religious tradition of revenge, an eye for an eye, while Portia argues for Christian mercy and forgiveness. But in the great trial scene she has to win according to the law. The document allows Shylock to cut Antonio with his knife, and he chooses to do this near Antonio's heart. but it does not say anything about blood. Shylock loses because Antonio must not lose a drop of blood when he cuts him. But Shylock is not the devil with red hair that Elizabethan audiences expected. He is given a great speech to prove that Jews are human like Christians, not devils. Shakespeare's understanding of people of all kinds allows him to make Shylock a real character and explain his behaviour. But this does not make him right. He uses the speech as an excuse for taking his revenge. During this busy time in the theatre, there was tragedy at home in Stratford. Shakespeare's only son, Hamnet, died in August 1596, at the age of 11. We do not know how Shakespeare felt, but it surely affected his view of life. 2 months after that, he was given a coat of arms, which was the sign of a gentleman. His father had asked for one a long time before, when he was the leader of the council in Stratford. John Shakespeare was probably pleased, but William made a joke about it in The Merry Wives of Windsor. It would not now belong to his family after his own death, though, because he had no son to follow him. We do not know anything about Shakespeare's private life in London. Stories about him suggest that he lived quietly and did not go out with other actors, drinking and looking for women. But the more powerful sonnets were probably written at this time, and they suggest that at times he felt guilty. One of the greatest of them, Sonnet 129, is about sex. All men know, he says, that sex without love seems attractive, but afterwards they are ashamed of it. But although they know this, they cannot stop themselves doing it. Shakespeare's success in the theatre had made him rich. His son was dead, but he now had even more reason to take care of his wife and daughters. Early in 1597, he bought New Place, the second largest house in Stratford. Anne and their daughters moved there later in the year, while his parents stayed at the house where Shakespeare was born.